The attempt to move as much ground as possible and recover as much gold as possible resulted in a variety of extraction methods, but none had as much impact or was more efficient than the bucket line elevator dredge.
It's working. It only required 4 men on the dredge. It was the area around that required the most attention. Preparing of the ground ahead of it was the big chore, as the dredge camp for this particular dredge had approximately between 100 and 120 employees just to help operate this dredge.
The dredges were very efficient. Under ideal conditions, the dredge could process nearly 14,000 square meters in a 24-hour period. 26 dredges were subsequently built in the Yukon, with the last one brought into the area in the 1950s. Dredge number 4 produced as much as 22,680 grams of gold in a single day. And in 1939, operating for 262 days on Hunker Creek, processed 1.3 million square meters of gravel, recovering 992,250 grams of gold, valued at $1 million. Number 4 dredge is the largest wooden hull bucket line dredge in North America. Constructed over a 2-year period from 1912 to 1913, it then dug its way upstream in the Klondike Valley to what was known as the Boyle Concession and sank there in 1924. In 1927, it was refloated and continued to operate until 1940. The Yukon Consolidated Gold Corporation rebuilt the dredge and operated it in the Bonanza Creek Valley from 1941 to 1959. It now rests on claim number 17. The Yukon Consolidated Gold Corporation donated the dredge to the Canadian Park Service in 1969. At that time, it was in sound condition, but was buried in approximately 6 meters of frozen silt and ice. Upon closer inspection, it was clear that ground movement was distorting the hull and superstructure, and that the resulting strains and stresses were damaging it. It was also suspected that rot was attacking the buried portion of the structure. In the early 1980s, Klondike National Historic Sites carried out a study into the situation of the dredge and decided that the best solution would be to take it out of the silt to halt the damage and to expose the structure for repairs and maintenance. With a displacement weight of 3,306 metric tons, this would prove a formidable challenge to the Canadian Forces 1 Construction Engineering Unit, contracted to deliver the project. The construction crew arrived on site April 29, 1991, following engineers' recommendations that the dredge be relocated by floating it onto a gravel pad nearby. The project was not without its problems, among them constant groundwater seepage, thick organic material, and heavy silt.
When we started excavating the first thing in May of '91, we found that after going down about 4 to 5 feet, we had gone through all the frozen ground and we hit muck, silt, and water. Then once we got started, we excavated around the whole thing by backhoe and hauled that away by truck and put all the spoil into a settling pond. Then we were supposed to finish the excavation with a dredge pump. What wasn't envisioned was the amount of organic materials that was in the ground. The pump was no good. We were wasting our time. So we went back to the good old-fashioned method of excavation with backhoes and dump trucks.
This was followed by the extraction of the ice and frozen silt from inside the dredge that had built up layer by layer over the 32 years it lay submerged. A variety of methods, including pumping in hot air, were tried, but the most successful was the use of water pumps and hoses.
You got to envision we had 7 manholes to work with, and they were full of ice right to the top. We had one laborer who it just becomes second home to him during the workday. He could go down in there and use a flashlight and feel his way around. The odd yell when he stepped in a hole and the water went into his hip waders. By moving 6-inch and 4-inch hoses and get it to fall like heavy rain, they eventually destroyed all the ice on the inside. And that was the biggest problem in '91, really, was getting the ice out of the inside of the hull.
Removing the ice was an exercise that would have to be repeated a second time when the crew returned for Phase 2 of the operation in the spring of 1992. This turned out to be easier than first expected.
This time we went back, we had about 5 foot of ice. It did not freeze to the deck. We had about 3 feet of clear water underneath the ice down to the deck. And what that helped is over the winter, that ice or cold water melted whatever ice was still down inside the hull and get rid of any corners of ice that were left the previous season. To expedite it sometimes, where the areas were big enough, we used chainsaws and we cut up ice blocks and just slid it out the window and out into the moat and let it melt away there.
To protect the dredge hull from ground moisture, a foundation was constructed on the new site, while a massive waterproof berm was formed to contain the water needed to float the dredge. The actual floating, moving, and sinking of the dredge to rest on top of the new foundation required exact precision and was met with hesitant expectations.
We were hoping for it to break loose, and it didn't. So we had to start putting a suction breaking kit in that had been devised by Major Jones and Captain Wisnowski. And in one fine day in June of 1992, we were going out for coffee break after being down in the hull. One of the laborers said, "This thing's floating." So we come back after coffee break, we took a couple of measurements and said, "Okay, we'll check it when we come back out after lunch." And we come up at lunchtime, we found out it was actually floating while we were working inside putting this suction breaking kit in. At which time I sent word into town for Major Jones and asked him to come out. And lo and behold, he pushed it by hand. That's how easy it floated.
Well, the dredge represents a part of the history that hasn't until just recently been commemorated, and that is the industrial history of Canada. And in that regard, it's quite significant. The dredge is the most heavily visited site of any of the sites that we operate here in Dawson. And we expect that people will get an awful lot of benefit and enjoyment out of going aboard and experiencing the dredge as it is now.
The construction of a protective berm around the relocated dredge and the backfilling of the excavation and restoration of the site were the final 2 steps in this unprecedented engineering feat.